few days ago, I revisited photographs from a Bangkok Pride shoot taken 3 years ago. What struck me was not nostalgia, but distance. The distance between the world in which those images were made and the world in which we are now being asked to understand them. They were taken only months before October 7th. Across Asia, Pride Month is now unfolding under conditions that challenge one of the central assumptions that shaped the past 2 decades, that rights, once secured, will endure, and that visibility would continue, however unevenly, to translate into protection, recognition, and dignity. That assumption, long associated with post-Cold War liberal optimism and articulated most famously by Francis Fukuyama's End of History's thesis, has not disappeared. Yet, the events of recent years, democratic regression, armed conflict, institutional paralysis, and growing geopolitical fragmentation have exposed how contingent that confidence always was. Even before 2023, the region was already navigating an uneven trajectory. Successive reports by Freedom House and the Varieties of Democracy Institute have documented sustained democratic backsliding across Asia, including the consolidation of military rule in Myanmar following the 2021 coup, the narrowing of civic space across parts of Southeast Asia, and increasingly contested pathways of legal reform in countries such as India. At the same time, moments of legal progress, including Thailand's move toward marriage equality, have unfolded alongside intensifying social conservatism, regulatory pressure, and persistent vulnerability for marginalized communities. Across the region, expansion and retrenchment coexist. Asia has never been a linear story of progress. It has always been a terrain of contradiction. What has changed is not the presence of contradiction, but the pace at which these contradictions are becoming more visible and the global conditions within which they now operate. Over the past 2 years, conflicts in Gaza, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo have exposed not only the scale of contemporary violence, but the fragility of the frameworks meant to restrain it. Investigations by the United Nations Human Rights Council, alongside reporting and legal analysis by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have documented patterns that raise serious concerns under international law, including potential war crimes and crimes against humanity. Yet, the legal architecture itself, grounded in instruments such as the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, remains formally intact. What appears increasingly contingent is not its existence, but its application. Its authority is no longer assumed, it is negotiated, contested, and at times disregarded. This is not only a crisis of violence, it is a crisis of credibility, a widening gap between the principal states, institutions, and international systems claim to uphold and their willingness to defend them consistently when political costs arise. For Asian societies, these developments are not distant. The region is deeply embedded in global economic, political, and digital systems. Escalating geopolitical tensions, including those involving Iran and the United States, reverberate through energy markets, trade routes, migration flows, and domestic political discourse. They reshape not only state behavior, but public expectations of what law, governance, and institutions are able or willing to protect. This shifting context matters for how pride is understood. For decades, pride has been narrated through a language of progress. Visibility leads to recognition, recognition leads to protection, protection leads eventually to equality before the law. This trajectory reflected in legal developments ranging from decriminalization to anti-discrimination protections, has produced meaningful gains, including those documented annually by ILGA World. But it has always been an incomplete theory of justice. Visibility is not the same as safety. Representation is not the same as redistribution. Inclusion is not the same as liberation. And legal recognition, while indispensable, is never self-executing. As generations of constitutional scholarship have emphasized, rights endure only when institutions, courts, legislatures, and political leadership remain willing to enforce them, and when publics remain willing to defend the human being behind the legal principle. When that political and institutional commitment weakens, rights that once appeared settled can become surprisingly fragile. Legal guarantees may remain on paper even as the conditions that sustain them begin to erode. That willingness can no longer be assumed. What the present moment reveals is not only that progress is uneven, but that it is reversible. Rights can be granted and narrowed. Protection can be celebrated and ignored. The language of dignity can be institutionalized while people are simultaneously exposed to violence, detention, or abandonment. This carries particular weight for queer movements. Because at its core, queer politics have never been only about identity. It has been about the architecture of human dignity itself. Who is protected, who is recognized, and who remains protected when political conditions shift. This is why the broader erosion of moral coherence across global politics cannot be separated from Pride Month. Not because all struggles are identical, and not because suffering should be collapsed into metaphor, but because the logic that permits the dehumanization of one population rarely remains contained. It travels, it adapts, it reappears across contexts. The legal imagination has long understood this. Rights do not exist in isolation. They form an ecosystem. Once exclusion is normalized in one domain, its boundaries remain rarely fixed. Precision matters. Palestine is not a metaphor. Sudan is not a metaphor. Congo is not a metaphor. Myanmar is not a metaphor. Queer persecution is not a metaphor. But moral seriousness does not require fragmentation. It requires the discipline to recognize how systems of disposability, authoritarianism, and selective empathy reinforce one another across borders. This is where Pride must recover some of its seriousness. Pride is not only a celebration of progress, it is a test of whether the language of dignity retains meaning when the world becomes difficult. Across Asia, this tension is already visible. Governments may endorse diversity while restricting dissent. Cities may market inclusivity while excluding migrant workers, refugees, and informal labor communities from the full promise of belonging. Corporate participation in Pride may expand even as broader political conditions become more restrictive. These are not contradictions to be resolved, they are conditions to be navigated. And they help explain why Pride matters differently in the present moment. If rights are more fragile than many assumed, and if democratic guarantees can no longer be taken for granted, then Pride cannot function solely as a celebration of progress already secured. Joy remains important. It should not be surrendered. For queer communities to gather publicly, to love openly, to build chosen families has never been trivial. But joy without memory becomes spectacle. Visibility without solidarity becomes decoration. Inclusion without moral courage becomes public relations. The task, then, is not to make pride smaller, but to make it more truthful about the instability of rights, more truthful about how the security of our own freedoms depends upon our willingness to defend the freedoms of others. More truthful, too, about the fact that many communities are being asked to celebrate while simultaneously living with uncertainty, precarity, and in some cases, fear. Now, Pride must remain more than a calendar of events. It must remain a civic argument that dignity is not ornamental, that rights are not discretionary, that the purpose of law is to restrain power precisely when sympathy fails, because no community should have to audition repeatedly for its own protection. Pride, then, cannot stand apart from the world's instability. It is one way of confronting it without surrendering to it. This year, Pride needs to feel different, not less joyful, more aware, not less visible, more accountable, not less celebratory, but more honest about what celebration must now carry. Because pride cannot mean only that we survived. It must also ask what kind of world we are being asked to survive within, and whether we remain willing to protect one another.